What if I told you that for 30 years the government was reading your telegrams? Not some of them, all of them. Every international message sent through major telegraph companies was quietly copied and filed away by the National Security Agency. No warrants, no oversight, just a friendly arrangement between the government and private companies that lasted from 1945 to 1975. Or that the FBI maintained lists of Americans who would be rounded up and detained if a national emergency was declared. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're documented history, the kind that eventually gets declassified and filed away in archives where most people never look. Before we dive in, if you find this kind of stuff fascinating, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got plenty more historical secrets to explore, and trust me, your high school history teacher definitely didn't cover this material. Tonight, we're going to talk about 99 things the government did and really hoped you'd never find out about. Some for understandable reasons, some for reasons that make you go, wait, they did what? So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about the classified side of American history. The parts that stayed secret until someone finally opened the filing cabinet decades later. Starting with a surveillance program that makes your privacy concerns about social media look quaint. NSA Project Shamrock, 1945 to 1975. Picture this, it's 1945. World War II just ended, everyone's celebrating, and somewhere in a quiet office, someone at the National Security Agency is having what they probably thought was a brilliant idea. They walked up to major US telegraph companies and said, essentially, hey, you know all those international telegrams people send? Mind if we just take copies of those for decades? And here's the wild part. The companies said yes. For 30 years, the NSA collected copies of international telegrams. Millions of them. No warrants, no oversight, just a friendly arrangement between the government and private companies. Like borrowing sugar from a neighbor, except the sugar is private communications and the neighbor is Western Union. The operation was called Shamrock, which honestly sounds more like a breakfast cereal than a surveillance program, but there it was, quietly running in the background of American life, like elevator music nobody asked for. When it finally came to light in the 1970s, people were understandably surprised. Turns out international telegrams weren't quite as private as everyone assumed. But by then, of course, the damage was done, the files were full, and the precedent was set for what would come next. NSA Project Minaret, late 1960s to early 1970s. Speaking of what came next, let's talk about Minaret. Because apparently, collecting telegrams wasn't quite enough. The NSA decided they needed something a bit more focused. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the NSA maintained what they called watchlists. These were lists of Americans, activists, celebrities, politicians, journalists, whose communications the agency wanted to monitor. And monitor they did, intercepting phone calls and cables without bothering with that pesky thing called a warrant. The justification, as always, was national security. The reality was that the NSA was listening in on people who opposed the Vietnam War, civil rights activists, and basically anyone the government found inconvenient at the time. Minaret operated in the shadows for years. The intercepted communications were shared with other agencies, sometimes with the names removed, sometimes not. It was surveillance as a form of housekeeping, tidying up dissent by cataloging it. When the Church Committee investigations exposed Minaret in the mid-70s, it became one of those awkward moments where the government had to admit, yes, this happened, and no, we probably shouldn't have done it. Reforms followed. Oversight increased. And the intelligence community learned an important lesson about getting caught. Family Jewels, CIA memo, 1973. Now, every organization has secrets. Most companies have an HR file labeled incidents we'd rather not discuss. But when you're the Central Intelligence Agency, your version of that file is a little more dramatic. In 1973, CIA Director James Schlesinger asked his staff to compile a report of all the agency's controversial activities, not because he was feeling particularly confessional, but because Watergate was unfolding and he wanted to know what skeletons were in the closet before reporters started rattling doors. The result was a 693-page document known as the Family Jewels. And let me tell you, it was quite the family reunion. The memo cataloged everything from assassination plots to domestic surveillance, human experiments to mail opening programs. It was like a greatest hits album, except every track makes you uncomfortable. For years, this document stayed classified, tucked away where only people with the right clearances could read it and quietly panic. Parts of it were finally released to the public decades later. Heavily redacted, of course, because even embarrassing history needs its privacy. The family jewels became a symbol of an era when intelligence agencies operated with remarkable freedom and even more remarkable creativity when it came to bending rules. Operation Mongoose, 1961 to 1963. Let's drift down to Cuba for a moment. It's 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion just failed spectacularly, and the Kennedy administration is looking for a way to save face and maybe, possibly, topple Fidel Castro's government without actually invading again. Enter Operation Mongoose. This wasn't some small covert operation. This was a full-scale program involving sabotage, propaganda, intelligence gathering, and a remarkable amount of creative thinking about how to destabilize a country 90 miles from Florida. The operation involved hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars. There were plans to disrupt Cuba's economy, support resistance groups, and generally make Castro's life as difficult as possible. Some ideas were serious, some were less so, but all of them reflected the Cold War mindset that defeating communism justified extraordinary measures. Mongoose ran for about 2 years before it was quietly shelved. It didn't achieve its goals. Castro remained in power, but it did establish a blueprint for covert operations that would be referenced for decades. And speaking of covert operations with ambitious goals and mixed results, let me tell you about Guatemala. Operation PB Success, 1954. 1954. Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz is implementing land reforms that redistribute unused land to peasants. Noble goal, right? Except some of that unused land belonged to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with deep ties to Washington. The CIA decided this was unacceptable. Not the poverty, mind you, the land redistribution. So they launched Operation PB Success, a covert operation designed to remove Arbenz from power. The operation involved propaganda, a small rebel army, and a campaign of psychological warfare that convinced Arbenz the U.S. was about to invade with overwhelming force. It worked. Arbenz resigned. A military government took over. United Fruit got its land back, and Guatemala descended into decades of civil war and military dictatorship that killed tens of thousands of people. The operation was considered a success at the time, proof that covert action could change governments without deploying conventional forces. It became a model for future interventions. Decades later, historians would look back and wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the victory everyone claimed it was. But by then, of course, the damage was done. CIA involvement in Iran coup, Operation TP-Ajax, 1953. Now let's rewind 1 year and travel east to Iran. 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh has nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking it out of British control. Britain is furious. The US is nervous about Soviet influence, and the CIA is asked to do something about it. What they did was help orchestrate a coup. Operation TP Ajax involved bribing officials, organizing protests, spreading propaganda, and generally creating enough chaos that the Shah of Iran could dismiss Mossadegh and consolidate power. It worked, technically. Mossadegh was removed. The Shah became an American ally. Western oil companies regained access to Iranian oil. Everyone in Washington high-fived and went home early. But here's the thing about coups. They have consequences. Long-term consequences. The kind that echo through decades. The Shah's regime became increasingly authoritarian, which eventually led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which gave us the hostage crisis, which shaped US-Iran relations for generations. Looking back, Operation TP Ajax is one of those historical moments where you can draw a straight line from seemed like a good idea to, oh no. The Pentagon Papers leaked 1971. Fast forward to 1971. The Vietnam War is dragging on. The public is being told things are going well, progress is being made, victory is just around the corner. And then Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst, leaks a secret Defense Department study to the press. The Pentagon Papers, as they became known, told a very different story. The document showed that government officials had serious doubts about the war for years. They knew things weren't going well. They knew the public was being misled, and they kept going anyway, sending more troops, escalating the bombing, all while privately acknowledging the war was probably unwinnable. The Nixon administration tried to stop publication with prior restraint, arguing national security. The Supreme Court disagreed. The papers were published. The public learned that their government had been less than honest about a war that was costing thousands of American lives. It was one of those rare moments when classified documents actually changed the conversation. Suddenly, skepticism about official statements seemed reasonable. Trust eroded. And the government learned that keeping secrets in the age of photocopiers was harder than it used to be. FBI's black bag jobs, pre-1971 exposure. Let's talk about something with a deceptively cheerful name. Black bag jobs. Sounds like a shopping spree, doesn't it? Like you're picking up groceries and maybe a nice handbag. Nope. Black bag jobs were illegal break-ins conducted by the FBI. Agents would enter homes, offices, anywhere really, without warrants. They'd photograph documents, plant listening devices, gather intelligence, and then leave without a trace. This wasn't some rogue operation. This was policy. For decades, the FBI conducted these surreptitious entries as a regular investigative technique. The justification was always national security, counterintelligence, preventing threats. The reality was that it happened a lot, to a lot of people, for a lot of reasons. The practice was exposed in the early 1970s when activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and leaked documents showing the extent of the Bureau's surveillance programs. Suddenly, everyone knew that the FBI had been conducting warrantless break-ins as casually as someone might run an errand. Reforms followed. Rules tightened. The Bureau had to find new ways to gather intelligence, but for years, black bag jobs were just part of how things were done. Church committee findings, 1975 to 1976. By the mid-70s, enough scandals had surfaced that Congress decided maybe, possibly, they should look into what the intelligence agencies had been up to. So they formed the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, and gave it a mandate to investigate. What they found was extensive assassination plots, domestic surveillance, mail opening, drug experiments, The committee uncovered decades of activities that ranged from legally questionable to downright illegal. The hearings were public, or at least partially public. Americans got to watch as intelligence officials testified about operations that sounded like they were from spy novels, except they were real, documented, funded by taxpayer dollars. The church committee's work led to reforms, new oversight structures, the FISA court, stricter rules about domestic surveillance. The intelligence community didn't love these changes, but they learned to live with them. And for a while, there was a sense that maybe things would be different, that the era of unchecked covert operations was over, that oversight would prevent future abuses. Spoiler alert, oversight is only as good as the people doing the overseeing. FISA Court created 1978. Speaking of oversight, let's talk about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, created in 1978. The idea was simple. Intelligence agencies could still conduct surveillance, but they'd need approval from a secret court first. The FISA court was designed to balance national security with civil liberties. Warrants would be required, but the process would be classified to protect intelligence methods. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. In practice, the FISA court became known for approving almost every request it received. Between 1979 and 2000, it approved over 12,000 warrants and denied none. The approval rate was roughly 100%, which is either a testament to how well prepared the applications were or a sign that the court wasn't much of a check on surveillance power. Critics called it a rubber stamp. Defenders said it ensured proper procedures were followed. Both were probably right. The FISA court continues to operate today, still secret, still approving warrants at a remarkable rate. It exists in that strange space where oversight happens technically, but nobody outside a select few knows what's actually being approved. Which brings us to the question of what exactly was being surveilled in the first place. Operation Chaos, CIA, 1967 to 1974. The CIA has a mandate: foreign intelligence, not domestic surveillance. That line is supposed to be clear, drawn in the sand like a property boundary. But then there was Operation Chaos, which ran from 1967 to 1974. The CIA collected information on U.S. anti-war activists, student protesters, and civil rights groups. They compiled files. They tracked connections. They monitored people who were exercising their First Amendment rights on American soil. The justification was that these domestic groups might have foreign connections, foreign funding, foreign influence. The reality was that the CIA was spying on Americans because those Americans were politically inconvenient. Thousands of people were monitored. Files were created. Informants were deployed, and all of it violated the CIA's charter, which explicitly prohibited domestic operations. When Operation Chaos was exposed during the Church Committee investigations, it became one of those moments where the agency had to explain why they'd crossed a line everyone agreed existed. The operation was shut down. Reforms were promised. Oversight increased, but the files remained. Thousands of pages documenting who attended which protests, who knew whom, who said what. All of it still sitting in archives somewhere. FBI surveillance of John Lennon, early 1970s. Let's talk about John Lennon. You know him. Beatles. Imagine. Cultural icon. Also, for a brief period, the subject of intensive FBI surveillance. In the early 1970s, Lennon was living in New York and becoming increasingly vocal about political issues. He opposed the Vietnam War. He attended protests. He was planning a concert tour that would coincide with the 1972 presidential election. The Nixon administration was not thrilled. So the FBI opened a file on Lennon, monitored his activities, and gathered information that could potentially be used to deport him. The surveillance was tied to immigration concerns technically, but the timing suggested it was more about silencing a prominent critic. Lenin's FBI file eventually grew to hundreds of pages. Phone calls were monitored, associates were tracked, and all of this because a musician expressed political opinions the government found inconvenient. Years later, after Lenin's death, his FBI file was partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests. It became a symbol of how far the government would go to monitor dissent, even when that dissent came from someone whose main threat was writing songs people liked. The Keith case backdrop, early 1970s. While all this surveillance was happening, the legal system was quietly setting boundaries. In 1972, the Supreme Court heard United States v. U.S. District Court, commonly known as the Keith case. The question was simple. Could the government conduct warrantless wiretaps for domestic security purposes? The Nixon administration said yes. The Fourth Amendment, they argued, didn't apply when national security was at stake. The Supreme Court disagreed, unanimously. They ruled that even in domestic security cases, the government needed a warrant before wiretapping. The Fourth Amendment still applied. National security didn't grant unlimited surveillance power. It was a rare moment of legal clarity in an era of expanding executive power. The decision established that there were limits, actual enforceable limits, on what the government could do in the name of security. Of course, the ruling only applied to domestic threats. Foreign intelligence surveillance remained a different matter entirely, one that would continue to evolve and expand in the decades to come. But for domestic surveillance, at least, there were now rules that someone somewhere would inevitably try to work around. Executive Order 906, 1942. Let's go back in time now. February 1942. World War II is raging. Pearl Harbor happened 2 months ago. Fear and panic are widespread. And President Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9062. The order authorized the creation of military zones from which any person could be excluded. It didn't specifically mention Japanese Americans, but everyone knew what it meant. Within months, over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, were forced from their homes and sent to incarceration camps. They lost their homes, their businesses, their belongings, everything. Families were given days to pack what they could carry and report to assembly centers. From there, they were sent to camps in remote areas, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The government called it relocation. Others called it what it was: mass incarceration based on ethnicity. People were imprisoned not for anything they'd done, but for who they were. The camps operated for years. Families lived in cramped barracks. Children went to makeshift schools behind fences. And the entire time, the government insisted this was necessary for national security. It became one of America's most shameful moments. The Supreme Court upheld internment in Korematsu, 1944. In 1944, Fred Korematsu challenged his internment in court. He'd refused to report to an assembly center, was arrested, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He argued that Executive Order 9062 violated his constitutional rights, that you can't imprison American citizens without due process, that ethnicity isn't grounds for incarceration. The Supreme Court disagreed. In a 6-3 decision, they ruled that the internment was constitutional. National security, they said, justified the exclusion orders. The military's judgment about threats took precedence over individual rights. Justice Robert Jackson, in his dissent, warned that the decision was like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. He was right. For decades, Korematsu stood as precedent, a legal justification for government overreach in times of crisis. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1980s, that Korematsu's conviction was vacated, and it wasn't until 2018 that the Supreme Court explicitly repudiated the decision acknowledging it was wrong. But for Fred Korematsu and the 120,000 others who were imprisoned, that came far too late. Operation Mockingbird is excluded. Now you might have heard of Operation Mockingbird, the alleged CIA program to influence media. That's a story for another time, already covered in other contexts. Instead, let's talk about something documented and official: the United States Information Agency. During the Cold War, the U.S. government ran official public diplomacy programs. The USIA, created in 1953, produced films, radio broadcasts, publications, all designed to spread American ideals and counter Soviet propaganda. This wasn't covert, it was open. Government-sponsored messaging aimed at foreign audiences, presenting America in the best possible light. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, cultural exchanges. The goal was to win hearts and minds by showcasing American values, democracy, freedom, opportunity, and sometimes it worked. American jazz, Hollywood films, and blue jeans became symbols of a lifestyle people wanted. But it was still propaganda, just the official kind. Messaging carefully crafted to influence opinions, shape narratives, and advance American interests abroad. The line between public diplomacy and propaganda has always been thin. The USIA walked that line for decades until it was folded into the State Department in 1999. The FBI's Security Index, Cold War. During the Cold War, the FBI maintained lists. Lots of lists. One of them was called the Security Index, a catalog of individuals who might be detained in a national emergency. The criteria for inclusion were broad: suspected communists, activists, people with the wrong friends or the wrong opinions. If the FBI thought you might pose a threat during a crisis, your name went on the list. For years, this list existed quietly in FBI files. Thousands of names, plans for mass detention. All of it prepared in case war with the Soviet Union turned hot and the government decided to round up suspected subversives. The program was exposed during congressional oversight in the 1970s. By then, Cold War paranoia had faded somewhat, and the idea of mass detention lists seemed excessive, even by Cold War standards. The Security Index was officially discontinued, but its existence revealed how far the government was willing to go in preparing for hypothetical emergencies: detention without charges, indefinite incarceration, all justified by national security concerns that never actually materialized. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder what other lists exist today, sitting quietly in databases, just in case. HUAC era, blacklists, late 1940s to 1950s. Let's talk about the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. During the late 1940s and 1950s, this committee investigated suspected communist influence in various industries, especially Hollywood. People were called to testify. They were asked to name names, identify associates, prove their loyalty. Those who refused, citing the Fifth Amendment, were labeled uncooperative. Their names ended up on blacklists. These weren't official government blacklists, technically. They were maintained by private industry, studios, networks, employers. But the effect was the same. If your name was on the list, you couldn't work. Your career was over. Writers, actors, directors, all blacklisted. Some for their political beliefs, some for refusing to testify, some just for knowing the wrong people. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined, and none of it required a criminal conviction. The blacklist era lasted years. It only faded when the political climate shifted and McCarthyism lost its grip. By then, countless careers had been derailed, families had suffered, and the entertainment industry had learned to fear congressional committees. The blacklists were eventually acknowledged as a dark chapter in American history. But for those who lived through it, that acknowledgement came far too late. Operation 1954. 1954. The U.S. government launched a large-scale immigration enforcement campaign aimed at removing undocumented workers from the country. At the time, the operation was given an official name that's now widely recognized as offensive, even by the standards of the era. Today, historians refer to it simply as a mass deportation campaign of the mid 1950s, reflecting both its scale and the harm it caused. The operation involved mass deportations of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. Immigration officers, Border Patrol, local police, all coordinated to round up people, often without checking citizenship status carefully. Hundreds of thousands were deported. Many were U.S. citizens or legal residents swept up in the enforcement actions. Due process was minimal. Rights were often ignored. The focus was on speed and numbers, not accuracy. Families were separated. People were deported to unfamiliar parts of Mexico, far from where they'd lived. Some died during transport due to harsh conditions. The operation was considered a success by its architects because it resulted in large deportation numbers, but it left a legacy of trauma and injustice, families torn apart, communities disrupted, and a demonstration of how quickly enforcement can become abuse when there's no meaningful oversight. Decades later, the operation's name alone would be seen as deeply problematic, a reflection of the casual dehumanization that enabled such aggressive enforcement. Bracero Program Abuses, 1942 to 1964. Speaking of immigration and labor, let's discuss the Bracero Program. From 1942 to 1964, the U.S. brought millions of Mexican workers to fill agricultural labor shortages, especially during World War II. On paper, it was a temporary worker program with contracts, wage protections, and standards. In practice, it was often exploitative. Workers faced wage theft, contracts were violated, portions of their pay were withheld, supposedly to be returned when they went home. Many never saw that money again. Working conditions were harsh, housing was inadequate, and complaining could get you sent home. Later lawsuits sought compensation for the withheld wages. Some former braceros eventually received settlements, but many died before seeing any money. The program became a case study in how temporary worker programs can be abused when enforcement is weak and workers have limited power. The Bracero program officially ended in 1964, after years of criticism. But its legacy shaped immigration policy debates for decades, a reminder that labor programs without strong protections can easily become systems of exploitation rather than opportunity. COGI, continuity of government, planning, Cold War to present. During the Cold War, the government developed extensive plans for what would happen if nuclear war destroyed Washington. These were called continuity of government plans, or COGI. The idea was straightforward: ensure the government could keep functioning even if the capital was vaporized. Secret bunkers were built. Succession protocols were established. Shadow governments were planned, ready to take over if everyone in the normal chain of command was gone. These plans were highly classified. Most members of Congress didn't know the details. The public certainly didn't, but somewhere in secure facilities, people were planning for the worst-case scenario. After the Cold War ended, COGI planning didn't stop. It evolved. The threats changed from nuclear annihilation to terrorism, cyber attacks, pandemics. The planning continued quietly in classified settings. After September 11, 2001, some COGI measures were reportedly activated. Details remain scarce. The planning is still classified. But the infrastructure remains, updated for modern threats. It's the kind of thing that sounds reasonable until you think about it too hard. Secret plans for unelected officials to run the government during emergencies. What could possibly go wrong? The Emergency Broadcast System, 1963. Speaking of emergency preparedness, let's talk about that sound. You know the one. The long, awful tone that interrupts your television or radio, followed by, "This is a test of the emergency broadcast system." The system was established in 1963 as a way for the president to address the nation quickly during a crisis, particularly a nuclear attack. It was designed for rapid national messaging when every second counted. For decades, Americans heard those test tones. Weekly tests, monthly tests, always the same disclaimer. This is only a test. And then the awful sound that seemed designed to induce anxiety even when you knew it was just a test. The emergency broadcast system was eventually replaced by the emergency alert system in the 1990s, which was then supplemented by the wireless emergency alert system for phones. But the principle remained the same: a way for the government to interrupt whatever you were doing and tell you something important was happening, or might happen, or could theoretically happen. The system has been used for weather alerts, missing children, and the occasional accidental false alarm that briefly convinces everyone the world is ending. The Manhattan Project secrecy, 1942 to 1946. Let's go back to World War II. 1942. The US government starts a secret program to develop an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project. Here's what's remarkable. Tens of thousands of people worked on this project. Scientists, engineers, construction workers, technicians. Cities were built in the desert. Facilities appeared in remote locations. Massive resources were deployed. And most of the people involved had no idea what they were building. The project was compartmentalized. People knew their specific task, but not how it fit into the larger picture. Workers enriched uranium without knowing what it was for. Technicians assembled components without understanding the final purpose. Secrecy was absolute. Even Vice President Harry Truman didn't know about the project until he became president after Roosevelt's death. Suddenly, he was briefed on the existence of the most powerful weapon ever created, something his predecessor had kept hidden even from him. The Manhattan Project succeeded in creating the bomb. It ended the war with Japan. It also ushered in the nuclear age, with all its existential dread and geopolitical complications. But the secrecy established a precedent. Massive government programs could operate outside public knowledge. Atomic test, downwinder exposure, disputes, 1950s. After the war, the US continued nuclear testing. Lots of testing. The Nevada test site saw over 900 nuclear detonations between 1951 and 1992. Communities downwind from these tests were exposed to radioactive fallout. People who lived in Nevada, Utah, Arizona, they were called downwinders. They watched mushroom clouds on the horizon like fireworks. The government assured them it was safe. The radiation levels were minimal, they said. No need to worry. Except people started getting sick. Cancer rates increased. Thyroid problems appeared. Patterns emerged that suggested the exposure wasn't as harmless as claimed. For years, downwinders sought compensation and recognition. The government resisted, citing uncertainty about causation, classified data, and national security concerns. Legal battles dragged on. Eventually, in 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, providing payments to some downwinders and uranium miners who developed certain cancers, but many had already died. Many others didn't qualify for compensation due to strict eligibility requirements. And the debate about how much harm was actually done continues today, complicated by decades of delayed disclosures and incomplete records. The mushroom clouds were spectacular. The consequences were less so. Operation Ivy and other tests' secrecy. 1952 onward. Speaking of nuclear tests, let's talk about Operation Ivy. 1952, the US detonated the first thermonuclear weapon, or hydrogen bomb, at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The test, codenamed Mike, vaporized an island. The fireball was 3 miles wide. The mushroom cloud reached 57,000 feet. It was more than 400 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Details about these tests remained classified for years. The public knew testing was happening, but specifics about yields, fallout patterns, and effects were kept secret. Even the scientists involved didn't always know the full scope of what they were creating. Calculations were theoretical. Reality often exceeded expectations. Over the following decades, hundreds more tests were conducted, some above ground, creating those iconic mushroom clouds, later underground after atmospheric testing was banned. The secrecy around these tests wasn't just about military advantage, it was also about avoiding public panic, about the weapons being developed and the risks being taken. Eventually, much of the information was declassified. But for decades, the full picture of America's nuclear testing program was hidden behind classification stamps and need-to-know restrictions. The CIA's A resistance culture, 1970s to 1990s, the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, passed in 1966. The idea was simple: give citizens the right to request government documents and receive them, with some exceptions for national security. The CIA was not thrilled about this. For decades, getting documents from the CIA through FOIA was like pulling teeth. Requests were denied, delayed, heavily redacted. Documents would arrive with entire pages blacked out. Sometimes just the page numbers remained visible. The agency argued that releasing information could compromise sources, reveal methods, endanger operation. And sometimes that was true. But often, the resistance seemed to be more about protecting embarrassment than protecting security. Many major disclosures only came after lawsuits forced the CIA to release documents. Journalists and historians would file requests, get denied, sue, and years later receive heavily redacted files that raised more questions than they answered. The culture of secrecy was deeply ingrained. The idea that the public had a right to know what their government was doing ran counter to an agency built on keeping secrets. Over time, this resistance became its own kind of scandal, proof that transparency was something the intelligence community would give only when forced. CIA Extraordinary Rendition, post-September 11th. After September 11th, 2001, the U.S. government faced a question. What do you do with terror suspects captured abroad when you want to interrogate them but don't want to bring them into the U.S. legal system? The answer was extraordinary rendition. Suspects were transferred to other countries, often countries with less strict rules about interrogation. The CIA would arrange the transfers. Partner countries would do the questioning. It was outsourcing, essentially. The U.S. got information without technically conducting the interrogations themselves. Plausible deniability, at least on paper. The program was secret for years. Eventually, journalists pieced together what was happening from flight records, witness accounts, and leaked documents. The scale of the program became clear. Dozens of suspects, multiple countries, years of operations. Legal scholars questioned whether it violated international law. The government argued it was necessary for national security. Some rendition flights stopped at Diego Garcia, a U.S. military base in the Indian Ocean. Others went to countries in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The network was extensive, carefully planned, and operated in the shadows. Details continued to emerge, slowly, through declassification and investigative reporting. The USA Patriot Act, 2001. 6 weeks after September 11th, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. That's an acronym, by the way. uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Someone spent a lot of time making that work. The act vastly expanded surveillance authorities. It allowed easier access to business records, expanded wiretap capabilities, and loosened restrictions on information sharing between intelligence and law enforcement agencies. It passed quickly, very quickly. The bill was over 300 pages long, and most members of Congress didn't read it before voting. The political climate after September 11 made opposition difficult. The Patriot Act became controversial almost immediately. Civil liberties groups warned about government overreach. Privacy advocates highlighted provisions that seemed to go far beyond targeting terrorism. Supporters argued it was necessary, that the threat was real and the government needed tools to prevent another attack. And that argument carried the day, at least initially. Many provisions were supposed to sunset, to expire after a set period. But they kept getting renewed. What was passed as emergency legislation became permanent parts of surveillance law. The debate about balancing security and liberty continues today, with the Patriot Act as the defining example of post-September 11th legal changes. Stellar Wind, early 2000s. Around the same time the Patriot Act passed, the NSA launched a secret surveillance program called Stellar Wind. It involved collecting vast amounts of communications data from Americans without warrants. The program was authorized directly by President Bush, bypassing the FISA court that was supposed to approve surveillance. It remained classified for years. Stellar Wind collected phone records, email metadata, and internet communications. The scale was enormous. The NSA was essentially vacuuming up data from major telecommunications providers and sorting through it later. The legal justification was the president's wartime authority. The operational justification was preventing another terrorist attack. The constitutional concerns were significant. When parts of Stellar Wind were revealed through journalism in 2005, the public learned that the NSA had been conducting warrantless surveillance on a scale previously unknown. The Bush administration defended the program as legal and necessary. Critics called it a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Legal challenges followed. Eventually, some aspects of Stellar Wind were brought under FISA court authority, but the program's existence revealed how much surveillance could happen in secret, justified by national security concerns and presidential authority. It was a glimpse into how technology and law had collided in the digital age. Section 215, Bulk Metadata, 2000s to 2010s. Section 215 of the Patriot Act became one of the most controversial provisions. It allowed the government to collect business records relevant to terrorism investigations. The word relevant turned out to be very elastic. Using this provision, the NSA collected phone metadata on millions of Americans. Not the content of calls they emphasized, just the numbers called, call duration, location data, the hubby who, when, and where, but not the what. The program operated in secret for years. The FISA court approved the collection, interpreting relevant to mean basically everything, since you never know what might be relevant to an investigation. When Edward Snowden leaked documents revealing the program in 2013, the public reaction was significant. People learned that their phone records were being collected in bulk, stored in government databases, and analyzed for patterns. The government defended it as a crucial counterterrorism tool. Privacy advocates called it a massive violation of privacy. Courts were divided on whether it was even legal. Eventually, the program was modified. The USA Freedom Act in 2015 ended bulk collection by the government, requiring phone companies to retain the data instead. But for over a decade, Section 215 enabled surveillance on a scale that would have been unimaginable in previous eras. The FBI's use of national security letters, 2000s. Let's talk about national security letters, or NSLs. There are administrative subpoenas the FBI can issue to companies for customer records without getting court approval. Banks, phone companies, internet providers, they can all receive NSLs demanding records. And here's the catch: they're accompanied by gag orders. The company can't tell anyone they received the letter, including the person whose records were requested. The FBI's use of NSLs exploded after September 11th. Tens of thousands were issued annually. Most sought communication records, financial information, subscriber data. The program operated with minimal oversight. No judge needed to approve them. The FBI supervisor decided what was relevant. The gag orders meant nobody outside the bureau and the company knew they were happening. Eventually, legal challenges questioned whether the gag orders violated the First Amendment and whether NSLs were being used appropriately. Some gag orders were lifted, some reforms were implemented, but national security letters remain a tool the FBI uses regularly. Most still come with gag orders. Most remain secret, and the person whose records are being collected usually never finds out. It's surveillance with a paper trail that nobody sees, demanding information that companies must provide, all operating under authorities expanded in the name of national security. CISP's monitoring, 1980s. Let's jump back to the 1980s. The FBI conducted surveillance of a group called the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, or CISPES. CISPs opposed U.S. policy in Central America. They organized protests, raised money for humanitarian aid, and generally made their opposition to U.S. involvement known. Protected First Amendment activity, in other words. The FBI investigated them anyway. For years. The Bureau monitored meetings, tracked members, and gathered information on a group whose main crime was political disagreement with administration policy. Later investigations found that the surveillance was inappropriate. CISPES wasn't engaged in terrorism or violence. They were engaged in advocacy. But that was enough to get the FBI's attention during an era when opposition to Central America policy was viewed with suspicion. The CISP's case became an example of how surveillance powers could be misused, how dissent could be treated as suspicious, and how the line between legitimate law enforcement and political monitoring could blur. It was exposed, criticized, and used as a lesson about the need for oversight. But it happened, documented and undeniable. Another item in the long list of surveillance programs that went too far. Operation Chaos, confusion with COINTELPRO. Now, you might have noticed Operation Chaos mentioned earlier and thought, wait, isn't that COINTELPRO? Common confusion. Let's clarify. COINTELPRO was an FBI program targeting domestic political groups with disruption tactics. That's been covered elsewhere, so we're leaving it aside. Operation Chaos was separate. That was the CIA program collecting information on anti-war activists. Different agency, different methods, similar problems with overreach. The confusion is understandable. Both operated during the same era. Both targeted similar groups. Both were exposed during the Church Committee investigations. Both violated principles about domestic surveillance, but they were distinct programs. Chaos was the CIA stepping outside its mandate to collect domestic intelligence. COINTELPRO was the FBI actively disrupting groups through infiltration and dirty tricks. Why does this matter? Because understanding the distinction shows how multiple agencies independently decided that monitoring Americans for political activity was acceptable. It wasn't one rogue operation. It was institutional practice across intelligence agencies. The Church Committee investigations exposed both, leading to reforms meant to prevent future abuses. Whether those reforms worked is a question we'll continue to explore as we go deeper into this list of things the government would prefer remained classified. FBI mail opening programs, mid-20th century. Speaking of programs that sound questionable, Let's talk about the FBI's mail opening operations. For years, the FBI conducted covert mail surveillance programs. They'd intercept mail, open it, photograph the contents, reseal it, and send it on its way. The targets were suspected spies, political activists, and basically anyone the Bureau decided needed monitoring. This was, to be clear, illegal. Opening someone's mail without a warrant violates federal law, but the FBI did it anyway, justifying it as necessary for counterintelligence. The scope was significant. Thousands of pieces of mail were opened over decades. The program operated quietly until it was exposed during the 1970s oversight investigations. When it came to light, there was the usual dance of justification, criticism, and reform. The FBI agreed to stop. Rules were tightened. Oversight increased. But the mail opening programs revealed something important. For intelligence agencies, legal restrictions were often viewed as guidelines rather than hard boundaries. If they decided something was necessary, they'd do it and worry about authorization later. The mail programs ended officially, but they established a pattern we'll see repeated. Covert programs, minimal oversight, eventual exposure, promises of reform. Project MKUltra exclusion. Note: you might be wondering about Project MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments. That's not here. It's been covered extensively elsewhere, including in previous scripts. Same with Operation Midnight Climax, the subset of MKUltra involving brothels and LSD, already covered, and Project Sunshine, the program that collected tissue samples from deceased children worldwide to study radiation exposure, also excluded both for repetition and for content concerns. The Tuskegee syphilis study isn't here either, for similar reasons. It's been discussed at length in other contexts and raises significant ethical issues that deserve more careful treatment than we can provide tonight. These exclusions aren't because the programs weren't significant. They absolutely were. They're not here because we're focusing on documented programs that haven't been as widely discussed, things that might surprise you rather than confirm what you already suspected. So if you came here expecting to hear about MKUltra for the 100th time, sorry. We're going deeper into the archives, pulling out lesser-known files, the ones that don't usually make the highlight reels, like the Lavender Scare, which we're about to discuss. The Lavender Scare, 1950s. During the 1950s, while McCarthyism focused on rooting out suspected communists, another purge happened quietly alongside it. It targeted gay and lesbian federal employees. Thousands of people were fired from government jobs, not for any security violations, but simply for being gay. The justification was that they were security risks, vulnerable to blackmail, potentially disloyal. The logic was circular and cruel. Being gay was stigmatized, which made people hide it, which supposedly made them blackmail targets, which supposedly justified firing them, which reinforced the stigma. The State Department alone dismissed hundreds of employees. Other agencies followed suit. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined, and all of it was based on prejudice dressed up as security policy. The Lavender Scare lasted years, operating in parallel with anti-communist investigations, but receiving less attention. It wasn't until decades later that historians fully documented the extent of the purges. In 2017, the State Department formally apologized for the Lavender Scare, acknowledging the injustice and harm caused. But for those who lost their careers and livelihoods in the 50s, that apology came far too late. It's a reminder that security concerns have often been used to justify discrimination. The Palmer Raids, 1919 to 1920. Let's go back even further. 1919. World War I just ended. The Russian Revolution happened. There's a communist scare sweeping America, the first Red Scare. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer authorized a series of raids targeting suspected radicals. Thousands of people were arrested in coordinated operations across multiple cities. Many were immigrants, accused of being anarchists or communists. Hundreds were deported without hearings or due process. People were arrested in their homes, at meeting halls, basically anywhere authorities suspected radical activity. The raids were aggressive and often violated civil liberties. Warrants were frequently absent. Legal representation was denied. Deportations happened quickly, before anyone could challenge them in court. Eventually, the raids became controversial. Critics, including some government officials, pointed out the constitutional violations. Public opinion shifted. The raids ended, but they established a precedent. During times of perceived crisis, civil liberties could be suspended in the name of national security. The idea that dangerous foreigners needed to be removed quickly took root. The Palmer raids faded from memory, overshadowed by later events. But they were an early example of how fear could drive government overreach, particularly targeting immigrant communities. Espionage Act Use Against Dissent, WI era. While we're in the World War I era, let's talk about the Espionage Act of 1917. The act made it illegal to interfere with military operations or support enemies during wartime. Sounds reasonable, right? Except it was used to prosecute people for anti-war speech. Socialists, pacifists, labor organizers, they were charged under the Espionage Act for speaking out against the war or the draft. Pamphlets were considered criminal. Speeches were prosecuted. Simply expressing opposition to the war could land you in prison. The Supreme Court upheld these prosecutions. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that speech creating a clear and present danger could be restricted. The example he gave was shouting fire in a crowded theater. Of course, arguing against a war isn't quite the same as causing a theater panic, but the precedent was set. The Espionage Act could be used against dissent. The act is still on the books. It's been used in recent years to prosecute government leakers and whistleblowers. The same law used against anti-war activists in 1917 is still being used today, just against different targets. It's one of those laws that sounds specific, but turns out to be remarkably flexible when prosecutors need it to be. The business plot exclusion. The business plot, the alleged 1933 conspiracy to overthrow FDR, isn't here. It's been covered in previous scripts. Briefly, Major General Smedley Butler testified to Congress that wealthy businessmen approached him about leading a coup against President Roosevelt. The plot supposedly involved using veterans as a private army. Congress investigated. Butler's testimony was taken seriously, but no criminal charges followed. Details remain murky. The extent of the actual conspiracy, if it existed, has been debated by historians ever since. It's a fascinating story, but since it's already been discussed elsewhere, we're moving on to other documented programs and events that deserve attention, which brings us to Albert Einstein's FBI file, because apparently even theoretical physicists weren't above suspicion. FBI file on Albert Einstein, mid-20th century, Albert Einstein, Nobel Prize winner, most famous scientist of the 20th century, author of The Theory of Relativity, also the subject of an FBI file that eventually grew to over 1,400 pages. Why? Because Einstein had political opinions. He was a pacifist. He supported civil rights. He criticized segregation. He had socialist sympathies. And J. Edgar Hoover found all of this deeply suspicious. The FBI monitored Einstein's activities, tracked his associations, and generally treated one of humanity's greatest minds as a potential security threat. They investigated whether he was a communist, whether he was involved in subversive activities, whether his political views made him dangerous. Einstein knew about the surveillance. He didn't particularly care. He continued speaking his mind, writing letters, supporting causes he believed in. The FBI file on Einstein is now publicly available through FOIA requests. Reading it is surreal. Page after page of agents documenting Einstein's speeches, his letters to newspapers, his attendance at rallies, all preserved for posterity in government files. It's a perfect example of how surveillance powers were used not just against spies or criminals, but against anyone whose politics made the authorities uncomfortable. Operation Snow White, Scientology versus U.S. government, 1970s. Now let's talk about one of the largest infiltrations of the U.S. government ever. And it wasn't done by a foreign power. It was done by the Church of Scientology. Operation Snow White, launched in the 1970s, involved Scientology members infiltrating dozens of government agencies. The IRS, the Department of Justice, the Coast Guard, foreign embassies. They posed as employees, volunteers, anyone who could gain access. Their goal was to find and destroy documents critical of Scientology and its founder, L. Ron Hubbard. They stole files, copied documents, and planted bugs. Over 5,000 members were allegedly involved at various levels. The operation was eventually discovered. In 1977, the FBI raided Scientology offices. They found evidence of the infiltration, theft, and conspiracy. 11 high-ranking Scientology officials were convicted, including Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard. They received prison sentences for conspiracy against the government. It remains one of the largest cases of domestic espionage in American history. But unlike most stories of government overreach we've been discussing, this was private citizens infiltrating the government. The irony is that it happened while intelligence agencies were being investigated for their own domestic surveillance programs. COINTELPRO's MLK letter exclusion, the FBI's infamous letter to Martin Luther King Jr., the one suggesting he should take his own life, isn't covered here. That's been discussed extensively in previous scripts and other contexts. COINTELPRO itself, the FBI's counterintelligence program that targeted domestic political organizations, is excluded for the same reason. It's well documented elsewhere. But it's worth noting that COINTELPRO's exposure was a turning point. When the program was revealed in the early 1970s, the public learned that the FBI had gone far beyond investigating crimes. They'd actively tried to disrupt, discredit, and destroy political movements. They sent fake letters, they planted false stories. They tried to break up marriages and turn allies against each other. The program targeted the Black Panthers, civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and many others. It was systematic, extensive, and completely outside the FBI's legal authority. When it was exposed, it led to investigations, reforms, and new oversight structures. The Church Committee mentioned earlier cataloged COINTELPRO's activities in detail. So, while we're not rehashing COINTELPRO here, its shadow hangs over everything we're discussing. It's the template for understanding how far agencies went when they operated without meaningful oversight. The FBI's surveillance of civil rights organizations beyond MLK, 1950s to 60s. Speaking of surveillance of civil rights movements, the FBI's attention wasn't limited to Martin Luther King Jr. They monitored numerous civil rights organizations throughout the 50s and 60s. The NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality. All were subject to FBI surveillance. Files were compiled. Informants were recruited. Activities were tracked. The stated justification was investigating potential communist infiltration. The reality was that the FBI was monitoring constitutionally protected political activity because J. Edgar Hoover viewed civil rights activism with suspicion. Agents attended meetings, photographed participants, and documented who spoke with whom. Later releases of FBI files showed the extent of the monitoring, thousands of pages on organizations whose crime was advocating for equal rights. This surveillance had a chilling effect. People knew they were being watched. Some hesitated to participate. Others persisted despite the knowledge that their names were going into FBI files. The surveillance continued even after civil rights legislation passed, even after the movement achieved major victories. The FBI kept watching, kept collecting information, kept building files on Americans whose only offense was demanding equality. It's a pattern we've seen repeatedly. Surveillance justified by security concerns, but actually targeting political dissent. Watergate plumbers, 1971. Let's talk about the Plumbers, a White House Special Investigations Unit created in 1971. The name came from their job, stopping leaks. After the Pentagon Papers were published, President Nixon wanted to prevent future leaks of classified information. So his administration created this unit, staffed by former FBI and CIA personnel. Their methods were creative. They broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for information to discredit him. They planned other operations that ranged from questionable to illegal. The Plumbers are most famous for the Watergate break-in, the June 1972 burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. That operation, botched and exposed, eventually led to Nixon's resignation. But Watergate was just one operation. The Plumbers represented a broader approach, using covert methods to protect the administration's interests. They were essentially running domestic intelligence operations out of the White House. When Watergate unraveled, the Plumbers' other activities came to light. The psychiatric office break-in, the plans for other operations, the whole apparatus of White House-directed covert action. It became a symbol of presidential overreach. What happens when the executive branch decides laws are suggestions rather than constraints? The Houston Plan, 1970. In 1970, Nixon aide Tom Charles Houston proposed expanding domestic intelligence gathering. The plan called for increased surveillance, more wiretaps, relaxed restrictions on breaking and entering, expanded mail opening. Essentially, it was a wish list of intelligence tactics that existing laws and regulations limited. The justification was national security and the need to combat domestic unrest and foreign intelligence activities. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover opposed it, not on civil liberties grounds, but because it threatened the FBI's turf. He didn't want other agencies conducting domestic operations. Nixon approved the plan, then days later rescinded it after Hoover's objections. Officially, the Houston Plan was never implemented. But here's where things get murky. Some of the tactics in the plan were already being used by various agencies. And evidence suggests that even after the plan was officially withdrawn, some of its recommendations were implemented informally. The Houston Plan became public during Watergate investigations. It showed how the Nixon administration viewed civil liberties as obstacles to effective intelligence gathering rather than constitutional protections to be respected. It was a blueprint for surveillance expansion that wasn't officially adopted but influenced thinking about what the government could and should do. The Southern Strategy era political realignment. During the 1960s and 70s, American politics underwent a major realignment. The Democratic Party, historically dominant in the South, began losing that region as it embraced civil rights. Republican strategists saw an opportunity. They developed what became known as the Southern Strategy, using coded language about states' rights, law and order, and welfare to appeal to white Southern voters uncomfortable with integration. This wasn't explicitly racial language. It didn't have to be. Everyone understood what was being signaled. Dog whistles instead of bullhorns. Implications instead of declarations. The strategy worked. The South gradually shifted from Democratic to Republican, reshaping American politics for generations. Party coalitions reorganized along new lines. Now, political realignments happen, parties evolve, but this particular shift was built partly on exploiting racial anxieties. And while the strategy was effective politically, it had long term consequences for how race was discussed in American politics. Years later, Republican National Committee Chairman Ken Mehlman apologized for the strategy, acknowledging the party had exploited racial polarization for political gain. But the realignment it created persists today, a reminder that political strategies, even coded ones, can reshape the landscape for decades. COG Project 908. Discussions Cold War. Remember those continuity of government plans we mentioned earlier? Let's dig a bit deeper into the specifics. During the Cold War, the government developed numerous classified programs for maintaining government function after a nuclear attack. One of these was sometimes referred to as Project 908, though much about it remains classified. These programs involved building secret bunkers, establishing communication networks, and creating protocols for who would be in charge if everyone in the normal chain of command was dead. Congress wasn't always fully informed about these plans. The programs operated with minimal oversight, justified by the need for secrecy in case of attack. Mount Weather in Virginia became one of the more famous locations, a massive underground facility designed to house government officials during a crisis. Similar facilities existed elsewhere, all part of the COG infrastructure. The planning raised questions nobody wanted to answer publicly. Who decides when to activate these plans? What powers would the emergency government have? How long would it last? These questions remain relevant today. COG planning continues, updated for modern threats. The infrastructure exists, ready to be activated if needed. And somewhere, probably, there are still people updating those plans, preparing for scenarios nobody wants to think about. Post-COINTELPRO reforms context. After COINTELPRO was exposed, reforms were implemented. The FBI established new guidelines limiting domestic surveillance. The Attorney General had to approve certain operations. Oversight increased. These reforms, implemented in the 1970s, were supposed to prevent future abuses. The FBI couldn't just open investigations based on political activity. There had to be evidence of actual criminal conduct. For a while, it seemed like things had changed. The reforms had teeth. Oversight bodies had access. Civil liberties seemed more protected. But reforms are only as permanent as the political will to maintain them. Over time, especially after crises like September 11th, some restrictions were loosened. New authorities were granted. The balance shifted back toward security and away from privacy. The post-COINTELPRO reforms didn't disappear entirely, but they were modified, reinterpreted, worked around. The underlying tension between security and liberty didn't go away just because rules changed. Understanding this context is important because it shows that even significant reforms can erode over time. Nothing is permanent in government policy except the tendency to expand power when given the opportunity. Which brings us to controversies that don't neatly fit into program names but deserve discussion nonetheless. The Gulf of Tonkin exclusion. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where reported attacks on U.S. Navy ships were used to justify escalating the Vietnam War, isn't covered here. It's been discussed in previous scripts. Briefly, in August 1964, the USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. A second attack was reported 2 days later. President Johnson used these incidents to get Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, dramatically expanding U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The problem was that the second attack probably didn't happen. Later analysis suggested it was a misreading of sonar and radar data, possibly influenced by weather conditions and nervous operators. But by the time doubts emerged, the resolution had passed and the war had escalated. Whether Johnson knew the second attack was questionable remains debated by historians. It became a textbook example of how incomplete or mistaken information can lead to major policy decisions with devastating consequences. But since it's been covered elsewhere, we're moving on to other documented government programs and events that deserve attention, like the Phoenix program in Vietnam. The Phoenix program exclusion. The Phoenix program, a controversial counterinsurgency effort in Vietnam, also isn't covered here. It's been discussed extensively in other contexts and involves content that requires careful treatment. The program, which ran from the late 1960s to early 70s, aimed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through intelligence gathering and targeted operations. It was effective by some measures, but also controversial due to concerns about interrogation methods and civilian casualties. The program's legacy is complicated and debated. Some military historians view it as a necessary counterinsurgency tool. Others see it as emblematic of the war's moral compromises. What's not debatable is that the program existed, involved thousands of Vietnamese and American personnel, and was part of the broader effort to combat insurgency in South Vietnam. Like many Vietnam War programs, Phoenix was later scrutinized and criticized. Congressional hearings examined its operations and methods. But given the content concerns and the fact that it's been covered elsewhere, we're leaving detailed discussion aside and moving on to post-Vietnam controversies like the Plame Affair. The Plame Affair exclusion. The Plame Affair, where CIA officer Valerie Plame's identity was leaked to the press in 2003, isn't covered here either. It's been discussed in previous scripts. The Basics, Plame's husband, former Ambassador Joseph Wilson, wrote an op-ed criticizing claims that Iraq sought uranium from Niger. Shortly after, columnist Robert Novak revealed Plame's CIA employment in his column. The leak sparked a criminal investigation. Eventually, Louis Scooter Libby, Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice related to the investigation. The affair raised questions about whether the leak was retaliation for Wilson's criticism, whether classified information was deliberately exposed for political purposes, and how the Bush administration handled dissenting views on Iraq intelligence. It became another example of how security and politics intersect, how classified information can be weaponized, and how investigations into leaks can themselves become political controversies. But since it's already been covered, we're moving forward to other post-September 11th controversies and programs that haven't received as much attention in popular discussions. Abu Ghraib exclusion, Abu Ghraib prison, and the abuse that occurred there isn't covered here. The content is too graphic and has been extensively discussed elsewhere. The basic facts are well known. In 2004, photographs emerged showing U.S. military personnel abusing Iraqi detainees at Abu Ghraib prison. The images shocked the world and severely damaged America's reputation. Multiple investigations followed. Some soldiers were court-martialed. Questions about interrogation policies and command responsibility were raised and debated. The scandal became a symbol of how the war on terror sometimes compromised American values. It raised questions about accountability, training, oversight, and what happens when detention operations lack proper supervision. Abu Ghraib's legacy continues to influence discussions about detention, interrogation, and military conduct. But given the nature of the content and the extensive coverage elsewhere, we're excluding detailed discussion here. Instead, we're focusing on other surveillance and intelligence programs from the same era that haven't been as thoroughly examined in popular discussions, programs that operated in the shadows while Abu Ghraib dominated headlines. PRISM exclusion. PRISM, the NSA program for collecting internet communications from major tech companies, isn't here. It was covered in previous scripts. Revealed in Edward Snowden's 2013 disclosures, PRISM allowed the NSA to collect data from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and other companies under FISA court orders. The program sparked massive controversy about privacy, surveillance, and whether tech companies were complicit in government spying. Companies issued carefully worded statements trying to explain their participation without admitting too much. The debate about PRISM continues today, influencing discussions about encryption, data privacy, and the relationship between tech companies and intelligence agencies. But since it's been covered extensively, we're moving on to other surveillance partnerships and programs that preceded the digital age, like Echelon, NSA Echelon Partnership, Cold War era. Let's talk about Echelon, a signals intelligence collection and analysis network developed during the Cold War. It involved the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the Five Eyes now alliance. The system intercepts communications, phone calls, faxes, emails, anything transmitted electronically. It uses satellites, ground stations, and intercept facilities scattered around the globe. For decades, Echelon's existence was classified. Hints emerged through investigative journalism and leaked documents, but official confirmation was minimal. The participating governments neither confirmed nor denied much about the program. European Parliament investigations in the late 1990s and early 2000s examined Echelon's capabilities and raised concerns about economic espionage, privacy violations, and the lack of oversight. The Five Eyes partnership continues today, more relevant than ever in the digital age. The intelligence sharing arrangements established during the Cold War evolved to cover internet surveillance, cyber operations, and modern signals intelligence. Echelon showed that surveillance wasn't just a national program, but an international collaboration. The scale was global, the ambitions were vast, and the oversight was minimal. It's the kind of program that makes you wonder what else exists in the classified world, partnerships and capabilities we won't learn about for decades. The no-fly list, secrecy, post-September 11th. After September 11th, the government created the no-fly list, a catalog of people prohibited from boarding commercial aircraft. The goal was preventing terrorists from using planes as weapons. Sounds reasonable. The problem was the secrecy. People found themselves on the list without knowing why, without being told how to get off, without any clear appeals process. The list grew. By some estimates, it eventually included tens of thousands of names. Some were obvious candidates, others were less clear. Children ended up on the list. Senators found themselves flagged, presumably due to name matches. Getting on the list was easy. Getting off was nearly impossible. The government wouldn't confirm or deny someone's presence on the list, citing security concerns. People couldn't challenge their inclusion because they couldn't get information about why they were listed. Legal challenges followed. Courts grappled with how to balance security with due process. Some rulings required the government to provide more information to listed individuals. The no-fly list continues to operate, somewhat more transparent than initially, but still largely secret. It's become a symbol of post-September 11th security measures that prioritize prevention over process, secrecy over accountability. COINTELPRO copycats, local police red squads. While COINTELPRO was a federal program, similar surveillance efforts happened at local levels. Many cities had police units called red squads that monitored political activists. These units operated from the early 20th century through the 1970s. They tracked union organizers, civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, basically anyone engaged in political activity the police considered subversive. Chicago's Red Squad was particularly notorious. They maintained files on hundreds of thousands of people. They infiltrated organizations. They disrupted meetings. They shared information with employers to get people fired. Los Angeles had a similar unit. So did New York. Cities across America created police intelligence divisions that went far beyond criminal investigation into political surveillance. When these units were exposed in the 1970s, often through lawsuits and investigations, cities faced criticism and legal challenges. Many red squads were disbanded or restricted, but the files remained. Decades of surveillance records sitting in archives, documenting who attended which meetings, who knew whom, who said what. The red squads showed that surveillance culture wasn't just federal. Local law enforcement developed their own programs, their own methods, their own targets. Chicago's Red Squad histories. Let's focus on Chicago specifically. The Chicago Police Department's Red Squad operated for decades, from the early 1900s through the 1970s. They infiltrated activist groups, sometimes with deep cover officers who spent years in movements. They photographed protesters. They maintained extensive files cataloging political activity. During the 1968 Democratic National Convention protests, the Red Squad was heavily involved in surveillance and intelligence gathering. The chaos of that week, with police clashing with protesters, had the Red Squad's fingerprints throughout the planning and response. The unit was eventually exposed through lawsuits in the 1970s. The Alliance to End Repression sued the city, leading to court orders restricting police intelligence activities. Files were opened to public inspection. What those files revealed was staggering. The Red Squad had monitored churches, community groups, civil rights organizations, basically any group engaged in political activity that police deemed suspicious. The consent decree limiting police surveillance lasted for decades. It was eventually modified after September 11th, with the city arguing that terrorism concerns required expanded intelligence capabilities. Chicago's Red Squad became a case study in local surveillance, a reminder that oversight is needed at every level of law enforcement. The FBI's COG-related emergency detention concepts, Cold War. Remember those continuity of government plans? They included provisions for what would happen to potential subversives during a national emergency. The FBI maintained lists of people who might be detained if war broke out. The security index mentioned earlier was part of this planning, but there were other lists too, broader categories of individuals who might warrant detention. The planning assumed that in a national emergency, particularly nuclear war, normal legal processes might be suspended. Mass detention could happen. Camps might be necessary. These plans were discussed in classified documents throughout the Cold War. They weren't widely known publicly until oversight investigations in the 1970s revealed their existence. The plans were never implemented. The nuclear war they anticipated didn't happen. But the existence of the planning showed how far the government was willing to go in hypothetical scenarios. Emergency detention planning has a troubling history in America. The World War II. Japanese-American incarceration provided a precedent. The Cold War planning extended the concept. Even today, questions remain about what emergency powers exist, what the government is authorized to do in crisis scenarios, and what protections remain when normal legal processes are suspended. Operation Underworld Exclusion Operation. Underworld, the World War II collaboration between the U.S. Navy and organized crime figures, isn't covered here. It's been discussed in previous scripts. The basics, concerned about sabotage on the New York waterfront. The Navy reached out to imprison mob boss Lucky Luciano through intermediaries. Luciano allegedly helped secure Union cooperation and provide intelligence about Axis activities. In exchange, Luciano's prison conditions improved, and he was eventually released and deported to Italy after the war. Whether the arrangement actually prevented sabotage or provided valuable intelligence is debated by historians. What's clear is that the government cooperated with organized crime figures because they had access and influence the government needed. It's a fascinating piece of history, but since it's been covered elsewhere, we're moving on to other World War II and Cold War programs that haven't received as much attention. Katyn cover-up exclusion, the Katyn Forest massacre, and American knowledge of Soviet responsibility isn't detailed here. It's been discussed in other scripts. In 1940, Soviet forces executed thousands of Polish military officers and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest. When the Germans discovered the graves in 1943, they blamed the Soviets. The Soviets blamed the Germans. The US government, needing Soviet cooperation during and after World War II, didn't publicly challenge the Soviet version, despite evidence suggesting Soviet responsibility. The truth wasn't officially acknowledged by Russia until 1990. American handling of information about Katyn, prioritizing alliance politics over publicizing atrocities, is a complicated piece of history. But given its coverage elsewhere, we're excluding detailed discussion. Instead, let's talk about Operation Keelhaul, another post-war controversy involving Soviet deportations. Operation Keelhaul exclusion. Operation Keelhaul isn't detailed here either, as it's been covered in previous scripts. But briefly, after World War II, Allied forces returned Soviet refugees and prisoners of war to Soviet control, despite knowing many faced imprisonment or execution. The operation was controversial. Many of those returned had fought against the Soviets or fled communist rule. Returning them meant sending them to likely death or gulag imprisonment. The policy was driven by agreements made at Yalta, where Allied leaders negotiated post-war arrangements, including the return of displaced persons. The human cost was significant, estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Operation Keelhaul became a symbol of Cold War moral compromises, where geopolitical considerations overrode humanitarian concerns. It's been examined by historians as an example of how alliance politics shaped post-war policies. But since it's been discussed elsewhere, we're moving to another World War II program with troubling post-war implications. Unit 731 Immunity, Exclusion Unit 731, the Japanese Biological Warfare Research Program, and American decisions about immunity for researchers isn't covered here. It's been discussed in previous scripts and involves content requiring careful handling. The basics: after the war, American occupation forces learned about Unit 731's experiments. Instead of prosecuting the researchers for war crimes, the U.S. granted immunity in exchange for research data. The decision was driven by Cold War competition. The data was considered valuable for American biological warfare research, and officials didn't want the Soviets to acquire it instead. The moral implications were stark. Immunity for researchers who conducted experiments on prisoners, trading justice for scientific data, Cold War priorities overriding war crimes, accountability. The decision has been criticized by historians and ethicists as a significant moral failure. But given its coverage elsewhere, we're excluding detailed discussion. Paperclip exclusion, Operation Paperclip. The program that brought German scientists to America after World War II, including some with Nazi pasts, isn't here. It's been extensively covered in previous scripts. The program brought over 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians to the U.S., including Wernher von Braun, who helped develop America's space program. Some had been Nazi Party members, some had used concentration camp labor. But their technical expertise was deemed valuable enough to overlook their pasts, especially as competition with the Soviets intensified. The program was controversial then and remains so today. It raised questions about moral compromises in the name of national security and technological advancement. Paperclip's legacy is complicated, contributing to American achievements in rocketry and space exploration, while representing ethical compromises made during the early Cold War. but since it's been discussed extensively elsewhere, we're moving on. Iran-Contra exclusion. The Iran-Contra affair isn't covered here either. It's been discussed in previous scripts and deserves more detailed treatment than we can provide tonight. The basics. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran, which was under an arms embargo, and used proceeds to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite congressional restrictions. The scandal involved multiple layers of secret operations, congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and debates about executive power and congressional oversight. It became a defining controversy of the Reagan presidency, raising questions about whether administration officials broke laws, whether the president knew about the operations, and what limits exist on executive branch covert actions. The affair has been examined extensively by historians, journalists, and congressional committees. Given that coverage and the complexity of the story, we're excluding it here. Savings and loan crisis exclusion. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and early 90s isn't covered here. While significant economically, it's been discussed elsewhere and doesn't quite fit our focus tonight. The crisis involved the failure of over 1,000 savings and loan institutions, costing taxpayers over $100 billion. Deregulation, fraud, and mismanagement all played roles. Some institutions were looted by insiders. Some made risky investments that failed. Regulators were slow to respond, and when they finally acted, the scale of the problem was massive. The bailout and resolution took years. Criminal prosecutions followed. Regulatory reforms were implemented. The crisis had lasting effects on financial regulation and public trust. But given its coverage elsewhere and our focus on intelligence and surveillance programs, we're moving on to other topics. The COINTELPRO era intelligence files culture. Let's talk about the broader culture of file keeping that existed during the COINTELPRO era and beyond. Intelligence agencies maintained enormous dossiers on Americans, cataloging everything from political activities to personal associations. The files were detailed: who attended which meetings, who donated to which organizations, who wrote letters to newspapers, all of it documented, cross-referenced, preserved. The FBI alone maintained files on hundreds of thousands of Americans. The CIA had files despite restrictions on domestic operations. Local police red squads kept their own records. When portions of these files were released through FOIA requests and court orders, the public got glimpses of how extensive the surveillance had been. Files on musicians, writers, activists, politicians, basically anyone who attracted attention. The files culture revealed something important. Surveillance wasn't just about immediate investigations. It was about building permanent records of political activity. CIA, Operation Condor, Knowledge Debates, 1970s. Operation Condor was a campaign of political repression and state terror involving intelligence operations and assassinations across South America during the 1970s. Military dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil coordinated efforts against political opponents. The extent of U.S. knowledge and involvement remains debated by historians. Declassified documents show American officials were aware of the coordination between South American intelligence services. Some evidence suggests tacit approval or limited support. The U.S. BRAS provided training to military and intelligence personnel from these countries. Some coordination happened through U.S. military channels, but the full extent of American involvement continues to be researched as more documents are declassified. Operation Condor resulted in thousands of deaths and disappearances. The campaign has been investigated by courts in several countries, with some officials convicted of crimes. American knowledge and response to Condor remains a subject of historical inquiry. NSA Upstream Collection, 2000s. Let's return to NSA surveillance. Upstream collection is the practice of intercepting communications directly from internet backbone infrastructure, the fiber optic cables that carry global internet traffic. The NSA, with cooperation from telecommunications companies, taps into these cables at key points. They can collect communications as they flow through, searching for specific selectors like email addresses or phone numbers. This is different from collecting data from tech companies like Google or Facebook. Upstream happens at the network level before the data reaches its destination. The practice was revealed in the Snowden disclosures. It raised questions about bulk collection, privacy protections, and the extent of NSA capabilities. Unlike targeted surveillance of specific individuals, upstream collection potentially captures vast amounts of internet traffic, including communications involving Americans. Legal and technical debates continue about what protections exist for Americans whose communications are incidentally collected during upstream operations. The state secrets privilege expansions, 20th to 21st century. The state secrets privilege allows the government to exclude evidence from legal proceedings if revealing it would harm national security. It's been used increasingly in recent decades. In cases involving surveillance, rendition, or classified programs, the government invokes the privilege. Sometimes entire cases are dismissed because the subject matter is deemed too sensitive. The privilege originated in a 1953 Supreme Court case, but its use has expanded significantly, particularly in post-September 11th litigation involving counterterrorism programs. Critics argue the privilege is overused, preventing courts from reviewing potentially illegal government actions. Defendants argue they can't get fair hearings if evidence is excluded for secrecy reasons. The privilege creates a catch-22. If a program is classified, victims of illegal surveillance or other government actions may be unable to challenge it in court because proving their case requires accessing classified information. Courts struggle to balance security and justice, often deferring to executive branch claims. Secret Service, Protective Intelligence Files, historical. The Secret Service maintains protective intelligence files tracking potential threats to protectees. This makes sense for their protective mission. But historically, the definition of threat was sometimes interpreted broadly. The files included people who made actual threats, but they also included people whose political views were deemed concerning. Activists who attended protests, basically anyone whose activities suggested they might pose a risk. The line between legitimate threat assessment and political surveillance could blur. Information sharing between agencies meant that Secret Service files sometimes overlapped with FBI political surveillance. Later, oversight and privacy reforms placed limits on what could be included in protective intelligence files. Criteria were tightened, retention periods were established. But for decades, the Secret Service maintained extensive files that went beyond direct threats, documenting political activity in the name of protection. The FBI's COINTELPRO and the 1971 Media, Pennsylvania burglary. We've excluded COINTELPRO details, but the burglary that exposed it deserves mention. In March 1971, activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole files and mailed them to newspapers. The documents revealed COINTELPRO's existence and tactics, showing systematic efforts to disrupt political organizations. The burglary was a turning point. Suddenly, the public had documentary proof of FBI domestic surveillance programs. The files couldn't be dismissed as speculation or conspiracy theory. The burglars were never caught, though some later revealed their identities decades later after the statute of limitations expired. Their actions triggered investigations that led to COINTELPRO's official end and significant reforms. It's one of those moments where illegal actions exposed illegal actions, raising questions about whistleblowing, civil disobedience, and accountability. The Church Committee's Castro Plot Catalog, 1975. The Church Committee documented extensive assassination plotting against Fidel Castro. The CIA and other agencies developed numerous schemes, some serious, some bordering on absurd. Plans involved poisoned cigars, contaminated diving suits, exploding seashells, and other creative methods. None succeeded, obviously, as Castro remained in power for decades. The plotting went beyond Castro. The committee documented assassination plans or attempts involving other foreign leaders, part of Cold War covert operations. These revelations shocked many Americans. The idea that the CIA was planning assassinations seemed like something from spy novels, not actual government policy. The Church Committee's work led to executive orders prohibiting assassinations of foreign leaders. The policy remains in effect today, though debates continue about its scope and application in counterterrorism operations. The Castro plots became symbolic of Cold War excess, operations that seemed justified at the time but later appeared reckless. CIA Tsar Rifle, reported by Oversight. Tsar Rifle was reportedly a CIA capability or program related to assassination operations, discussed during Oversight-era investigations and documentation. Details remain limited, with much still classified, but Oversight reports reference Tsar Rifle as part of the apparatus for planning or conducting assassination operations during the Cold War. The program's existence illustrated how the CIA compartmentalized sensitive operations, creating capabilities that could be deployed when needed while maintaining plausible deniability for leadership. Like many covert programs from that era, Tsar Rifle operated in the shadows, known only to those with specific clearances. Its exposure during oversight investigations revealed how much the CIA had been doing outside public view. The program was discontinued as part of post-oversight reforms. Assassination capabilities were officially ended, at least in theory. But Tsar Rifle's existence showed the infrastructure that had been built for operations that bypassed normal legal and ethical constraints. Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia, 1969 to 1970. During 1969 and 1970, the Nixon administration secretly expanded the Vietnam War into Cambodia. Bombing operations targeted North Vietnamese forces operating in Cambodian territory. The operations were concealed from the American public and Congress. Bombing reports were falsified to hide the true targets. Pilots were told to report strikes as occurring in South Vietnam even when they were in Cambodia. The secrecy lasted over a year. When the operations were eventually revealed, they sparked controversy about presidential war powers and congressional authority. The bombing contributed to destabilizing Cambodia, creating conditions that helped the Khmer Rouge eventually take power with devastating consequences. The secret bombing became another example of executive branch expansion of military operations without congressional authorization, justified by national security concerns but raising constitutional questions about checks and balances. Operation Menu, Cambodia, bombing code name. The specific code name for the Cambodia bombing operations was Operation Menu. Individual bombing campaigns within it had meal-related names: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, dessert, supper. The military's fondness for bland code names reached peak absurdity with food-themed names for secret bombing campaigns, as if calling it breakfast somehow made it more palatable. Operation Menu involved thousands of bombing missions over 14 months. The tonnage dropped was significant, though exact figures were classified for years. The operation's secrecy extended to record keeping. A dual reporting system was established to hide Cambodian targets. Official reports showed strikes in Vietnam while actual targets were in Cambodia. When Operation Menu was exposed, it became evidence in debates about presidential power during the Watergate era. The secrecy seemed to confirm concerns about unchecked executive authority. The operation ended in 1970, replaced by acknowledged bombing of Cambodia. The Bay of Pigs, pretext planning, 1961. Before the Bay of Pigs invasion, internal planning documents showed officials anticipated potential political fallout if the operation failed. They understood the risks, but believed success was possible. The planning assumed that once the invasion began, Castro's government would collapse quickly. Internal opposition would rise up. The landing force would secure a beachhead and establish a provisional government. None of that happened. The invasion failed quickly. The exile force was overwhelmed. Most were captured. And the Kennedy administration faced exactly the political disaster the planning documents had worried about. Documents later showed that some officials had doubts, but were overruled by optimistic assessments. Intelligence estimates were flawed. Assumptions about internal Cuban opposition were wrong. The Bay of Pigs became a case study in groupthink, flawed intelligence, and planning that ignored warning signs. It influenced how future operations were assessed and approved. The Tonkin Resolution context. We excluded the Gulf of Tonkin incident itself, but the resolution that followed deserves mention. After the reported attacks, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Johnson broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. The resolution passed overwhelmingly. Only 2 senators voted against it. It essentially gave the president a blank check for military escalation without a formal declaration of war. The resolution became the legal basis for massive expansion of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of troops were deployed under its authority. Years later, as doubts about the incident emerged and the war became increasingly unpopular, the resolution was seen as too broad, granting too much unchecked power. Congress eventually repealed it in 1971. But by then, the war had expanded far beyond what most who voted for the resolution had imagined. FBI anonymous letters tactic. Throughout COINTELPRO and other operations, the FBI used anonymous letters as a disruption tactic. They'd write letters designed to create suspicion, sow discord, or damage reputations. Letters would be sent to activists accusing colleagues of being informants. Letters to spouses suggesting infidelity. Letters to employers suggesting security concerns. All unsigned, all designed to create chaos. The tactic was effective because recipients didn't know the letters came from the FBI. They appeared to be from concerned insiders or whistleblowers. Trust eroded, groups fractured. This went far beyond legitimate law enforcement. This was active disruption of legal political activity using deception and psychological manipulation. When the tactic was exposed, it became one of the most criticized aspects of FBI domestic operations. Writing fake letters to destroy organizations and relationships seemed particularly underhanded. It's a reminder that surveillance wasn't passive observation, but active interference. The FBI's surveillance of Muhammad Ali, 1960s. Muhammad Ali, boxing champion and cultural icon, was monitored by the FBI during the 1960s. His opposition to the Vietnam War draft and his conversion to Islam made him a person of interest. The FBI tracked his activities, speeches, and associations. Files documented his anti-war statements and his membership in the Nation of Islam. Agents monitored his movements and compiled reports. Ali's draft resistance led to his boxing titles being stripped and his being barred from the sport for years. The surveillance continued throughout this period. Later releases of FBI files on Ali showed the extent of the monitoring. Hundreds of pages documenting the life of an athlete whose main crimes were having political opinions and religious beliefs the government found concerning. Ali's surveillance fit the pattern. Prominent figures who opposed government policies attracted FBI attention, regardless of whether they'd committed any crimes. The FBI monitored the Black Panthers, 1960s to 70s. The Black Panther Party was heavily surveilled by the FBI during the late 1960s and early 70s. The Bureau viewed the group as a threat and devoted significant resources to monitoring and disrupting it. COINTELPRO tactics were extensively used against the Panthers. Informants were planted. Anonymous letters were sent. Tensions between the Panthers and other groups were exploited. The surveillance and disruption contributed to the organization's decline. Members were arrested. Leaders were imprisoned or killed in confrontations with police. The group fractured under pressure. Later investigations documented how far the FBI went, including evidence suggesting Bureau involvement in incidents that resulted in Panther deaths. The monitoring of the Panthers remains controversial, debated by historians examining the line between legitimate law enforcement and political persecution. The FBI monitored the American Indian Movement, 1970s. The American Indian Movement, or AEM, faced extensive FBI surveillance during the 1970s. The organization advocated for Native American rights, treaty enforcement, and sovereignty issues. The FBI viewed AEM with suspicion, particularly after the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. The standoff lasted 71 days, involving armed activists and federal agents. Surveillance included informants within the movement, wiretaps, and extensive documentation of activities and members. Files were compiled on leaders and participants. The monitoring contributed to tensions that sometimes escalated into violence. Several AIM members were killed in confrontations. Legal cases followed, some raising questions about FBI conduct. Later investigations documented the extent of surveillance and suggested that some FBI actions went beyond legitimate law enforcement into harassment and disruption. The monitoring of AEM fit the broader pattern of federal surveillance targeting activist movements during this era. The FBI's surveillance of anti-Vietnam groups, 1960s to 70s, anti-war groups opposing U.S. involvement in Vietnam, faced systematic FBI surveillance throughout the 1960s and early 70s. Students for a Democratic Society, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and numerous other organizations were monitored. The FBI maintained files on protest organizers, tracked demonstrations, and recruited informants within movements. The scale was extensive, involving field offices nationwide. Some informants were students, some were veterans, some were provocateurs who encouraged illegal actions that could justify arrests. The surveillance extended to monitoring teach-ins, rallies, and peaceful protests. Simply attending an anti-war demonstration could result in your name appearing in FBI files. When these programs were exposed, they raised questions about whether the FBI had been protecting national security or suppressing legitimate political dissent. The monitoring of anti-war groups became evidence supporting reforms and oversight, though debates continue about where the line should be drawn. The FBI's monitoring of subversive artists, 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, the FBI monitored artists, writers, and entertainers whose political views or associations seemed concerning. Files were maintained on people whose main activity was creating art. Charlie Chaplin had an FBI file. So did Ernest Hemingway, Georgia O'Keeffe, and countless others. The files documented their political statements, associations, and activities. Sometimes the monitoring was justified by suspected communist affiliations during the Cold War. Other times, it seemed driven more by cultural conservatism or discomfort with celebrity political activism. The files often contained more gossip than genuine intelligence. Personal relationships, drinking habits, rumored affairs, all documented alongside political activities. These files revealed how surveillance extended beyond traditional security concerns into cultural and political monitoring. Being creative and outspoken was apparently enough to warrant government attention. The artist's surveillance became another example of how intelligence gathering expanded beyond its stated purposes. The NSA's long secrecy around Shamrock Minaret. Remember Project Shamrock and Minaret from earlier? Let's revisit the secrecy surrounding them. These programs operated for decades before becoming public knowledge. The NSA's culture of secrecy meant that even Congress wasn't fully informed about domestic surveillance programs. The programs ran year after year, collecting communications, building databases, all outside public view. When they were finally exposed during the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s, the revelations shocked even some government officials who hadn't known the extent of NSA domestic activities. The long secrecy enabled the programs to continue unchecked. No external review, no public debate, no congressional oversight, just the NSA deciding what was necessary and doing it. The exposure led to reforms, including the creation of the FISA court. But it took decades of secret operations before accountability mechanisms were established. It's a reminder that secrecy itself can enable abuse. Koji secrecy after September 11th. After September 11th, 2001, continuity of government plans were reportedly activated. The details remain largely classified, but officials acknowledged that COG measures were implemented. Vice President Cheney and other officials spent time at secure locations. Communication networks were activated. Emergency protocols were followed. The extent of COG activation and what powers were exercised remains unclear. The plans are classified. Congressional briefings on COG operations are limited. Some reporting suggested that COG measures remained partially active for years after September 11th, with shadow teams ready to take over if another attack disabled the government. The secrecy around post-September 11th COG operations reflects the ongoing tension between transparency and security. The public doesn't know what emergency powers exist or under what circumstances they might be activated. COG planning continues, updated for modern threats, still operating largely outside public view. The NSA's Five Eyes intelligence sharing. The Five Eyes alliance, mentioned briefly with Echelon, deserves more attention. The United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand maintain deep intelligence sharing relationships dating back to World War II. The arrangement allows extensive data sharing. Intelligence collected by one nation can be shared with others. This sometimes raised questions about whether countries were circumventing domestic restrictions by having allies collect data they couldn't gather themselves. The Five Eyes partnership shaped global surveillance capabilities. Together, the five nations could monitor communications worldwide. Their geographic positions allowed comprehensive coverage. The partnership continues today, more important than ever in the digital age. Cybersecurity threats, terrorism, and global communications all fall within the Five Eyes scope. Critics argue the arrangement lacks transparency and oversight. The public doesn't know what's being shared or under what rules. The Five Eyes shows that surveillance is increasingly international. The FBI's use of informants in political groups. Throughout the 20th century, the FBI extensively used informants within political organizations. Sometimes informants simply reported on activities. Other times, they actively participated, even leading groups. The informant strategy created problems. Sometimes informants encouraged illegal actions to justify investigations. Sometimes they became so embedded they shaped the movements they were supposedly just observing. In some cases, informants outnumbered genuine activists. Groups making plans didn't realize that half the people in the room were reporting to the FBI. The informant culture contributed to paranoia within movements. Trust eroded. People suspected colleagues of being government agents. Sometimes they were right. When informant use was exposed, it raised questions about entrapment, about whether the FBI was uncovering plots or creating them, and about the ethics of infiltrating political organizations. The use of informants continues today, particularly in terrorism investigations, raising ongoing debates. Post-COINTELPRO reforms. Attorney General guidelines. After COINTELPRO was exposed, Attorney General guidelines were established to limit FBI domestic surveillance. The guidelines required evidence of criminal activity before opening investigations. Political activity alone wasn't sufficient justification. The reforms represented a significant change in FBI operations. For decades, the Bureau had investigated political groups with minimal oversight. Now there were rules. The guidelines evolved over time. Different attorneys general modified them. After September 11th, they were loosened to allow more proactive investigations. But the principle remained. The FBI needed some basis beyond political activity to investigate Americans. The days of investigating groups simply for their views were supposed to be over. Whether the reforms work depends on whom you ask. Civil liberties advocates argue that surveillance still targets political activism. Law enforcement argues the guidelines provide necessary flexibility while preventing past abuses. The debate continues. The Pentagon Papers Redux. Prior restraint attempts. When the Pentagon Papers were published in 1971, the Nixon administration tried to stop publication using prior restraint, asking courts to prohibit newspapers from publishing classified information. The case moved quickly to the Supreme Court. The government argued that publication threatened national security. The newspapers argued that the First Amendment protected their right to publish truthful information. The Supreme Court sided with the newspapers in New York Times, v. United States. The decision affirmed that prior restraint was almost never justified, even for classified information. The ruling was a significant victory for press freedom. It established that the government couldn't simply suppress publication by claiming national security. But the case didn't resolve all questions. The decision was narrow. What criminal liability might follow publication wasn't addressed. The Pentagon Papers case remains central to debates about press freedom, classified information, and government secrecy. The CIA's secrecy around coup, 1950s to 60s. The CIA's involvement in coup during the 1950s and 60s remained classified for decades. Operations in Iran, Guatemala, and other countries weren't publicly acknowledged until documents were declassified years later. This meant that textbooks taught incomplete history. Students learned about regime changes without knowing about American involvement. Public understanding of U.S. foreign policy was shaped by what remained secret. When documents were eventually released, often decades after the events, the historical narrative changed. What had seemed like organic political changes were revealed to have American fingerprints. The delayed disclosures meant that policy debates happened without full information. Decisions about future interventions were made without public knowledge of past operations. The secrecy around Cold War coups showed how classification can shape historical understanding, allowing governments to control narratives by controlling information. Declassification delays. Let's talk about how long secrets stay secret. Government documents are often classified for 25 years or more. Some remain classified for 50 years, some even longer. The declassification process is slow. Agencies review documents page by page, redacting information deemed still sensitive. Sometimes entire documents are withheld. This means that historians researching recent history can't access primary sources. The full picture of events from the 1980s or 90s often remains incomplete. Major releases often happen decades after events, when most participants are dead or retired. Accountability becomes historical rather than contemporary. The delay in declassification shapes public understanding. Events are initially understood through official statements. Only decades later do internal documents reveal what officials actually knew and discussed. Declassification delays ensure that secrets impact history twice. once when they're kept, shaping what the public knows, and again when they're revealed, reshaping historical understanding. FOIA litigation as disclosure engine. The Freedom of Information Act created a right to request government documents, but getting them often requires litigation. Journalists and researchers file FOIA requests. Agencies delay, deny, or heavily redact documents. Requesters sue. Courts order releases, years pass. Some of the most important disclosures happened only because someone sued and persisted through years of legal proceedings. Documents that should have been released weren't until courts ordered agencies to comply. FOIA litigation became an industry. Public interest groups, journalists, and historians learned to use courts to force transparency. Agencies learned to resist, delay, and fight releases. The process is slow and expensive. Most requesters give up. Those who persist sometimes get valuable documents, but only after exhausting administrative and legal processes. FOIA created a right to know, but exercising that right often requires resources, patience, and legal expertise. Overclassification. Problem government officials and oversight bodies have repeatedly acknowledged that too much information is classified. Documents are marked secret when they shouldn't be. Classification levels are too high. Duration is too long. Overclassification happens for various reasons. Sometimes it's bureaucratic caution. Better to classify than risk being wrong. Sometimes it's covering up mistakes or embarrassment rather than protecting legitimate secrets. Multiple reviews have found that significant portions of classified material could be released without harming national security. But the classification system has more incentive to err on the side of secrecy. Overclassification has costs. It prevents public debate. It hides government mistakes. It allows problems to fester without scrutiny. Reforming the classification system is difficult. Agencies resist change. The culture of secrecy is deeply embedded, and genuine national security concerns provide cover for excessive classification. The overclassification problem persists, acknowledged but not solved. Embarrassment classification. A specific type of overclassification deserves mention. Documents classified to prevent embarrassment rather than protect security. Historians have documented numerous cases where information remained classified long after any operational security value ended. The classification seemed designed primarily to avoid public relations problems. Mistakes, policy failures, controversial operations, all sometimes stayed classified to protect institutional reputation rather than national security. When these documents are eventually released, they often confirm suspicions that secrecy was about politics rather than security. The information causes embarrassment, not danger. This type of classification undermines the entire system. If people believe classification is used to hide mistakes rather than protect secrets, trust in the system erodes. The problem is difficult to address because those making classification decisions have incentives to protect their agencies' reputations. External oversight can catch some cases, but embarrassment classification likely continues. The long arc of secrecy, as we near the end of our tour through classified history, let's reflect on patterns. Secrecy enables programs that wouldn't survive public scrutiny. Operations run for years, even decades, before exposure. When secrets are revealed, often through journalism, leaks, or oversight investigations, reforms follow. New rules are established, oversight increases, agencies promise to do better. Then gradually, the reforms weaken. Crises create pressure for expanded authorities. Restrictions are loosened. The cycle repeats. Each generation faces similar questions about balancing security and liberty, transparency and secrecy. Each generation implements reforms. Each following generation faces choices about whether to maintain those reforms or prioritize other concerns. The history we've covered tonight isn't just about past programs. It's about ongoing tensions in democratic governance. How much power should intelligence agencies have? How much oversight is necessary? When does security justify secrecy? These questions remain unresolved. Surveillance in the digital age. The programs we've discussed evolved as technology changed. Telegraph surveillance became phone surveillance, became internet surveillance. The medium changed, but the impulse remained. Today's surveillance capabilities would astound Cold War intelligence officers. The amount of data generated, collected, stored, and analyzed is unprecedented. Digital communications leave trails that earlier generations never imagined. The legal frameworks haven't kept pace. Laws written for telephone wiretaps struggle to address email, encryption, social media, and location tracking. New capabilities outpace oversight mechanisms. Privacy has changed fundamentally. Data once scattered or ephemeral is now permanent and searchable. Government surveillance capabilities are vast, but so is commercial data collection. The question isn't whether surveillance will happen, but under what rules and with what oversight. The challenge is creating frameworks that work for digital age capabilities while respecting constitutional principles designed for an analog world. The perpetual tension security and liberty exist in perpetual tension. More of one often means less of the other. Finding the balance is the challenge democracies continually face. After crises, security concerns dominate, powers expand, oversight loosens, the pendulum swings toward security. Eventually, abuses are exposed, reforms are implemented, oversight increases. The pendulum swings back toward liberty, then time passes. The crisis that prompted reforms fades from memory. New threats emerge. Security concerns rise again. Neither extreme is sustainable. Pure security without oversight enables abuse. Pure transparency without secrecy hampers legitimate operations. The goal isn't to end the tension, but to manage it, to have robust debate about where lines should be drawn, to maintain oversight mechanisms that catch abuses while allowing necessary operations. The 99 programs and events we've discussed tonight represent moments when the balance shifted too far towards secrecy. From telegraph surveillance in the 1940s to metadata collection in the 2000s. From Red Squads monitoring activists in Chicago to the NSA tapping into internet backbone infrastructure. From Cold War detention lists to post-September 11 rendition flights. All of it documented now, sitting in archives, waiting for historians to piece together what actually happened while everyone was being told something else. The pattern is always the same. Secret programs operate for years. Eventually, someone leaks a document, a journalist investigates, or a congressional committee starts asking uncomfortable questions. The truth comes out. The cycle starts again. Somewhere right now, there are programs operating in classified settings that we won't learn about until 2040 or 2050, when some future historian files a Freedom of Information Act request and discovers what was really happening during our time. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember this. History is written twice. Once by the people making it in official statements and press releases, and again, decades later, when the classified files are finally opened and we learn what was actually going on. Sleep well. And be grateful that at least now you know about the telegraph thing. That's progress, right? Good night.